back online. I'm excited to be here tonight with Pastor Dave and Pastor DeAndre. I'm Pastor Megan, and we are going to dig into evangelicalism a little bit tonight, guys. This is a little bit of a hot thing in our. I feel like we're part of a denomination, the Evangelical Covenant Church, and we've been talking as a staff for a while about what does it mean to actually be evangelical in the way that we understand it and in the way that the world understands it. So if you are here watching with us, know that we are dealing with the wonderful gifts of modern technology and also the limits of it, in that our file is waiting to be fully ready for export. So I want to encourage you in this moment to think about who you might want to have this conversation with. You're here with us right now, but there's someone, a friend of yours, someone in your circle that might want to watch with you, have a conversation. Do you hear an echo? No, I don't anymore. Okay. But is there someone in your frame that anytime you mention the word evangelical, they stop for a second? Pastor DeAndre, when you told people you were coming to be a pastor at an Evangelical Covenant Church, did you get any?
Yeah, I got quite a few looks of, are you sure that's what you want to do? So it's definitely drawn a lot of attention and kind of pulls people in both directions.
Yeah.
So I first met Jesus in an evangelical church, and I've kind of gone and dabbled in different traditions, but that's always been the baseline for me. And Megan, I think that's true for you as well. DeAndre, is that true? I don't think that's true for you. I know you've actually had a lot more of a meandering path. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I guess I grew up in Pentecostal church, so a part of the evangelical movement, definitely evangelical tendencies. And so even with the tension now, I still have a lot of my forming and my shaping is rooted in evangelicalism. And so working through and kind of deconstructing those areas that I find hard to accept and kind of tag on to.
But isn't that I don't know, what's sort of interesting about this conversation is that we're all in it and none of us have left it. And in DeAndre's case, you came back to it. And yet there's something that's not totally right in the water here.
Yeah, it's such a broad term that I know I've definitely had to stop and say, okay, let's not take a term and make it so generic and kind of do I guess the older people say, you eat the chicken and spit out the bones. And so there are great aspects of evangelicalism that I love and I appreciate and we need as Christians. And so I'm excited about this conversation to work through that with you all together.
Pastor Dave, do you want to give us a little preview you'll introduce Walter Kim to us in the conversation, but one of the things that I think is most interesting about this is the depth of your relationship with Walter, that this isn't just a random person you're interviewing. Could you help, I don't know, just explain a little bit about that and why you wanted to invite him into this conversation with you today?
So Walter and I, actually, we go back more than 20 years. And we first met when we were both at divinity school at Harvard and kind of connected because we were two of the very rare evangelicals. And there was actually, some people think, oh, there's no evangelicals there. That was not true. There was a group of us that met, super devoted, and it was a number of faculty and a number of students. While I was there, Mark Knoll came through and N.T. Wright came through and spent a year with us. We had actually some amazing faculty that worked with us. And so I had a great experience there, but the real kind of the deepest part of it, no doubt, was Walter. Walter and I would meet together 2 or 3 times a week and we would pray for one another. We'd pray for our families. We'd talk through issues because of course, we are evangelicals, but we're in an environment that isn't necessarily super friendly to that. And so we would be able to parse, hey, what are we learning? Where do we need to take this challenge seriously? Where is it that actually maybe that's not as well-founded a challenge? So we just did a lot of our processing and digesting together. And so we really grew. And I had been then working at Park Street Church Walter stayed longer at Harvard. He ended up going on to do another degree. And so he and I just remained very, very close friends. But then when High Rock was starting, I moved over from Park Street Church to High Rock, and literally Walter's wife took my job as I left Park Street. So we literally just kind of transitioned. And then Walter followed soon thereafter and then worked at Park Street. And he was there up until about 2 years ago. And so he and I we've been able to continue to stay in relationship and enjoy each other. And so then it was when he left Park Street about maybe a year and a half ago. The timeline's a little rough. He went down to Virginia and to a church that I'd actually known very well when I was in Virginia, but then was kind of tapped to be the next president of the National Association of Evangelicals, which is a major position. But he's somebody who's just got the scholarly depth and the pastor's heart. And so for that reason, I just think he's a perfect candidate for that.
Hmm. And so the organization that he is the president of, you guys allude to it a little bit in your conversation, encompasses what, are there like boundaries or requirements for people like to get in to be a part of that organization? Or is it just like, you want to be a part of us? Okay, come with us.
It's going to be more the latter. And I think, and I allude to this a little bit later, that one of the things that evangelicalism has been great at is building bridges. And so what we end up doing is it's not like a denomination, right? You can be an evangelical, and I'm going to define a little bit later on what exactly constitutes an evangelical. But for many, many years, it was because it was started, kind of the resurgence of evangelicalism in the United States was in the 40s and 50s. Harold John Ockengay, the pastor of Park Street Church, was sort of the brains. He and Carl Henry was really the builder of the organization. Pew, a lot of you guys know, the Pew Charitable Trust. We hear that. Pew was the bucks, and then Billy Graham was the big mouth, and they kind of put him out. And so what would end up being is you had all these people who were divided into these separate camps. You had the Presbyterians, and you had the Episcopalians, and you had the Baptists, and you had the Pentecostals. You had all these different people, and basically the kind of the line was, "Oh, you like Billy Graham? Oh, I like Billy Graham. Oh, okay, we're evangelicals." And so for a long time, people who didn't know the official definition just came down to that sense. Do you resonate with that gospel-centered revivalist message of Billy Graham? And I think that's how a lot of people have kind of understood it as a populist movement, not necessarily knowing all of the theological heft and why it is that they started. And so the real reason they got it started in the U.S. is this is, all these churches have been together. And then it was when the Scopes trial came, you had the fundamentalist modernist divide. They split up. And so the church was separated. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But then you got this group of people that I mentioned earlier who are saying, hey, we want some of the hot religion, religion where people are really passionate. It's changing their lives. It's centered on the scriptures and taking God seriously. We want that. And we want the social reform, the social justice that we see in the moderns. We want both. And yet we don't want to be either of those two groups. And so they started this new thing that was supposed to be a counterpoint to both called neo-evangelicalism. And that's really what we are the recipients of today. Well, the National Association of Evangelicals is recognizing you've got all these huge organizations that share this same heart and tried to bring them together under one umbrella. And so, as I say, we're really good at building bridges. Hey, come on in. If this resonates with you, come in. As a result, anybody who wants to come in can. And I think one of the challenges became in the 90s and 2000s when some of the other religious groups in America were falling into disrepute. It sort of became socially acceptable to be an evangelical. So lots of people jumped in, even if they didn't totally share our sort of the spirit of kind of our religion, what we were really about. They didn't even understand that fully, but it was a way of getting cultural approval, of becoming something people could recognize. And so as a result, we grew a ton, but I think we got diluted in the process. And again, we're going to talk a lot about that tonight.
And I think that actually feels like one of the distinctives between denominations and movements. in that denominations tend to have a lot more framework for being a Lutheran, being a Methodist, and then even within, Lutheranism, there's all of the different synods and that ascribe to different things, but to not have some of those entrance points, and then even within like the Covenant Church, there are fewer of those. It is really easy to move away from the things that are in the center, which can produce really wonderful things, but also lead us to this point. And if you attended our webinar that we hosted about a week and a half ago, just recognizing that the ways it diluted the evangelicals' power, like ability to interact with society, because you had people who didn't understand the core roots of the movements that they were ascribing to. And so I would encourage you, if any of you are looking for another stimulating conversation, if you haven't, to check out our Law and Order in the Church webinar that aired. It's here on High Rock Online, but it's looking at some of that historical involvement of particularly the white evangelical church around social justice and reform, and the role of it's tracing that. So to me, like, the lack of clarity has done really good things, because we can all get behind movements together towards positive change, and also put us in this place where sometimes I can feel like my back is against the wall, and I don't know, like, who are my people?
Yeah. I think there's a subtext to this conversation that we're having today, and this actually could come up either later in the chat after we talk with Walter, or in the subsequent weeks. I mean, there's a bigger question that I'm asking. We are a part of the Evangelical Covenant Church, but that was not its original name. And I would actually argue that part of the reason we are the Evangelical Covenant Church is we were trying, our denomination was trying to say, hey, we want to step into the mainstream. Mm-hmm. And so, like everybody else, we took the name. And yet, I no longer think that name serves us very well. And because of what evangelicalism has come to mean in our current society, I don't think that reflects at all what the covenant is all about. And so one of the questions I'm asking is, should we, High Rock, should we be leading a movement in our denomination to change the name back, perhaps, to what it was before? And I would tell you that the original name was Mission Friends, which everybody hears that and thinks, oh my gosh, that is the most hokey name ever. And I totally thought that when I first heard it. But as I've gotten to be a part of this for a long time, I've actually realized it's really pretty descriptive of what we are. We're a whole bunch of people who are on a mission for Jesus, and we want to do it together. Mission Friends. And I'd rather have a name that is hokey and descriptive than a name that kind of sounds normal, but in fact may be deceptive. And I think that evangelical has become that because of what it now represents. Now, Walter obviously wouldn't totally agree, but that's my take on it.
But isn't that the point? That you can still be mission friends, that you don't have to agree on all of the things and still hold your relationship with Christ as the center, is the most primary piece. Yeah. DeAndre, how did that hit you?
No, yeah, I really appreciated those thoughts, and it just really took me back to a professor during my divinity school time who really emphasized the brokenness in language. And so asking those questions, are terms worth savaging that cause us to lose the whole purpose of why we gather? And so even if there still are parts of the evangelical movement that we appreciate and we want to keep, it's asking that question of what damage does this do to the mission and the purpose of us gathering as a body, and being willing to kill the cow that needs to die. I think that's so important, and just being open to evaluating that and inviting people to have those conversations, and also facing like what it is that we're really dealing with. And those terms, especially evangelicalism, when you look at people that look like myself, who have often been on the other end of what evangelicalism has stood for, and we've been deprived of because of the movement. And so I really appreciate that thought and that invitation to consider, what does it mean for us as a church to be at the forefront of saying, we want to do more than just gather. We want to be mission friends. And what does that require of us to do?
Looks like we're getting ready to go here, guys. Woohoo. I
want to just make a point as we're just getting lined up here. Joy Huang wrote into the chat. I'm able to see some of the chat stuff go by. I'm going to be honest. I'm pretty new to this Facebook stuff. And so as a result, I'm trying to figure it out as we go. But Joy talks about how when she talks to a bunch of her friends from kind of her evangelical past, she felt the need, I'm just quoting from what she wrote here in the comments, I felt the need to justify that High Rock isn't that type of evangelical church. Mm-hmm. And I think that exactly points to this problem, that the name is not building bridges for us anymore. It's actually ending conversations. And so a lot of people have told me, hey, you just got to live it out in such a way that, people then can see what kind of evangelical you are. And I say, they actually won't let me live it out with them in that kind of way. Once they hear I'm an evangelical, one of the jokes that we all used to make, all these pastors used to make on the plane is, if you're flying and you just want to be left alone on an airplane and somebody's chatty, right? If you want to talk and they say, what do you do for a living? You say, oh, well, I'm a social entrepreneur. And that always generates interesting conversation. But if you really just want a little peace and quiet, you say, oh, I'm an evangelical pastor. And you might actually get the seat next to you empty. And so it's one of these things that's just becomes such a repulsive idea. And I think, how did that happen? How did the word good news become such bad news for everybody?
Well, let's watch this stimulating conversation and find out. Friends, use the chat to drop your questions. We will want to engage with you more after this. And thanks for sticking around so far. We'll see you in just a couple more minutes after we watch this video together. Go. That could have been a really smooth transition.
It was so good. You were like totally on that.
Honestly.
This is like one of those scenes in a movie. They're like, trying to introduce the guy coming from the back of the, the curtain, and he's not there. And they do the drum roll again. Da-da-da-da-da, da-da!
You know what? It'll happen when it happens. This is one of the gifts and curses of live things. Because I love that I can happening in this conversation. I would rather just say ECC than say that he's part of the Evangelical Covenant. And, Dave, for me, when I tell people that I'm an evangelical pastor on a plane, I don't know if it's my haircut or something, but people really do want to talk to me then. Not that kind of evangelical. So maybe we could give you the same kind of haircut as me. Oh. What do we think?
That might do it. That might do it.
We put a poll in here. I want to poll.
Let's not put that poll in here. I don't know if that function exists, but I don't want to do that. But that is actually, honestly, okay, so just being candid, that actually makes this more poignant for me. People, when they know I'm an evangelical and they look at me, then I'm the white evangelicals that they're hearing about in the news. Yeah. And I kind of go, well, no. Yeah, I am an evangelical and I am white. I'm not the white evangelical. And that becomes very difficult to overcome. Whereas I do think there's a way that you're right. You've chosen to sort of identify outside the lines, which I think then makes it really intriguing. And I just have not been able to pull that off yet, but maybe I'll get a mohawk and color it pink. And
still time. You still can do at-home haircut. Yep.
There's still time.
And same thing. I feel this once I've, let my friends know that I'm a part of an evangelical church. There's this urge to give definition to, again, oh, wait a minute. Let me tell you about the conversation I've had with Pastor Dave. And this is where we are as a church. It makes you want to just look at that term even more. And is it really worth hanging on to?
Yeah. Right. Through all this time, we, even as I'm saying it right now, the Evangelical Covenant Church, I never say that when I'm with insiders, right? We never use the word. We always just call ourselves the Covenant. Mm-hmm. But when people look at our website, that's the first word they see. We actually we're trying to buy a building in Wellesley just last year, and as we were doing that, I may get cut off here. We'll see. We were doing that. We had this great conversation going, all that kind of stuff, until they found out we're an evangelical church. And the pastor of the church who was selling to us said, I would rather burn this church to the ground than sell the evangelicals. And I thought, so much hurt been done in the name of evangelicalism, that is the response that people have. And I just feel like that's exactly what we need to address. And hopefully that's what we're going to address here in our conversation today. Hi, I'm Dave Swaim, pastor of the High Rock churches around Greater Boston. And tonight, I'm going to be talking with Walter Kim, president of the National Association of Evangelicals, about my ambivalence towards the word evangelical. On the one hand, I'm more devoted than ever to what that word represents officially. On the other hand, I'm more uncomfortable than ever with what it represents colloquially. Frankly, given the way I see that word used in the media, I'm ashamed to be associated with it. Today, I want to give you a quick introduction to what evangelicalism is and what went wrong, so you can appreciate the conversation that Walter and I are going to be having. The word evangelical comes from a Greek word that means good news. Christians have used the term in different ways, but historian David Bebbington summarizes the 4 defining characteristics of evangelicals in America as conversionism, the belief that lives need to be transformed through a personal encounter with God and a lifelong process of following Jesus. It's not enough to check the right boxes on a theology quiz. It's a dynamic relationship with God that shapes your life. Second is activism. We have to put love into action by sharing the good news and serving others through individual care and social reform efforts. Third is biblicism, obedience to the Bible as the ultimate authority. And the fourth is crucicentrism. It's a fancy word that just means a stress on the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross as making possible the redemption of humanity. Now, some of the best people and organizations I've ever encountered have been evangelicals. I'm proud to be associated with the International Justice Mission, combating sex trafficking, Compassion International, World Vision, World Relief, who are fighting global poverty, the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement. All of these have distinctly evangelical origins. Why? Because evangelicals believe that a changed life from encountering God and obeying the Bible so that we follow Jesus results in a love so powerful that we'll gladly sacrifice for others. But that's not what most of us think of when we hear the word evangelical these days. Why not? What went wrong? Well, at the risk of oversimplifying something complex, here's the essential problem. No one owns the word evangelical, so people get to define it however they like. When the word fundamentalism fell into disrepute, especially after 9/11, fundamentalists rebranded by co-opting the name of a group held in much higher esteem at the time, evangelicals. Soon, white nationalists also gathered under that banner. So although fewer than 10% of Americans affirm the 4 defining characteristics of evangelicals today, 35% of Americans call themselves evangelicals anyway. As a result, I keep seeing evangelicals in the news who represent values that I find repugnant precisely because I'm an evangelical. In public discourse, the word has become synonymous with bigot, homophobe, racist, misogynist, nationalist. That's not good news. And it's antithetical to what Jesus is all about. So here's the question. Should we fight to rescue our word from the haters who try to hide behind our banner in a quest for political power? Or is it time to repudiate that word and let those of us who are devoted to evangelical values regather under a new name that we can define from scratch? Today, the National Association of Evangelicals released a statement that attempts to resuscitate the word evangelical. Is it worth it? Is it too late? That's what I'm going to talk about with their president, Walter Kim, in just a moment. Afterward, Pastors Megan and DeAndre will join me for a live chat with any of you who want to share your thoughts or ask questions. I'm glad you're with us, and I hope you find this helpful. Well, hey, everybody, and welcome. I'm so glad that you're here for my conversation with Walter Kim. Dr. Walter Kim is the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. And full disclosure, Walter and I actually had a long friendship. He and I were prayer partners back in divinity school. We have been friends for many, many, many years. And I love to talk about pretty much any subject with Walter because he's thoughtful, he's wise, he just considers all angles. He's just a fascinating person about anything. But in particular, I'm excited about the topic we're going to discuss today because by virtue of his role, and in fact, really the reason he has this role, he really is a leading voice of evangelicalism today. And I think that right there is a funny space to be in. Now, as I've been clear, if you watch the opening video, I am as devoted as I have ever been to what evangelicalism represents officially. But these days, given what's going on in the media and in the political landscape, I am more uncomfortable than I have ever been identifying with evangelicalism in the way that word is used colloquially. And so I wanted to be able to talk to Walter about that. And the real question that I've got is it worth trying to resuscitate the name, help redefine it for people, recapture it from the sort of fundamentalists and white Christian nationalists that have co-opted the term, or is it time just to let go, give it to them, and lets us abandon that term and regather under a new banner that allows us to say something that sounds more like the love of Jesus than what seems to be being said in the name of evangelicalism. This day doing this is not random. Today, the National Association of Evangelicals, in partnership with many, many, many other Christian organizations that sort of gather under their banner, they've released a statement that I've signed trying to re-articulate the heart of evangelicalism in this fractured political moment. And really, I see that as an attempt to try to resuscitate the name. And that's why I want to figure out, is that even a worthwhile endeavor? So, Walter, welcome. And I'm glad you're here. I'd love to hear your take on some of this.
First of all, Dave, thank you for inviting me into this conversation. And the appreciation is mutual. I've always loved talking with you on virtually any subject, and I've appreciated that friendship over many, many years. So thanks. And I want to say that I'm so deeply encouraged, inspired by the kind of work that God is doing at High Rock, and the fact that you would even have a conversation like this and seek for a nuanced way forward is the best of evangelicalism, whether you want to call yourself that or not. So let me respond in brief, and then we'll have a conversation more at length. Is it worth recovering? Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the work and the substance of evangelicalism is worth recovering and bringing forth to the public mind. And if there's been a failure of the church, the evangelical church in particular, to make its presence known in a way that is recognizably for the blessing of society, then that's on us. That's a problem way beyond nomenclature. It's a problem of actual cultural presence and blessing. So my first and greatest concern is the fact that evangelicalism has been co-opted, in your words, from a kind of gospel presence to the most shrill voices. Well, you can partially blame the media for that. Of course, they're going to want to go to the most shrill voice because that's what's going to get the hits. But in part, is the failure, in fact, that we have not been substantively present in our society, a presence of blessing in our school districts, in our neighborhoods, a presence of blessing in word and deed by what we mean as evangelicalism, as gospel people, good news people. That's a more substantial problem. And if nothing else, this pandemic is putting a mirror to us as followers of Jesus, of saying, what really is our presence? What is the most essential thing that we can gather around in our worship and in our witness? And that's first and foremost the area of soul searching, I would say, for evangelicalism. It's a soul searching of what is it that we are really presently doing and being in our society. The name is secondary. It's not unimportant. It is definitely there. But I wouldn't want the tail to wag the dog. The more essential thing is a really good, hard look at how deeply the gospel has settled into the hearts and the soul of the evangelical church and has seeped out into society. And we have a lot of soul searching to do.
So I oftentimes hear people make an argument like that, but my own experience doesn't necessarily validate that concern. We all are in our own little eddies. None of us are quite able to see everything in the river. But I would venture to say, prior to the pandemic, I traveled a lot more than the average person. I go to countries all over the world, and I've very rarely seen whatever that country is famous for, its best tourist attraction, because I pretty much never go to resorts. I'm always going to these marginalized communities. I think, I'd make an argument. I've probably been to as many orphanages in the globe as probably anyone. That's just has been a particular passion and calling of mine. And I'm going to tell you what I see every time I go to a disaster zone, a war zone, a place of true, obscene poverty, is the people that I encounter there, right, besides the local indigenous population, are evangelicals and nuns, Catholic nuns, who have been there in season, out of season, 20, 30, 40 years, serving without any fanfare. When I go into inner cities and I see places that are being, terribly abandoned by our government systems and all that kind of stuff, I see churches. And I see churches that have been there faithfully serving, not only local churches, I see suburban churches making partnerships of long standing and depth. So I feel like the reality of the kind of evangelicalism that you and I both have in our heads and admire, I see that lived out all the time. I see it lived out in our own church, the incredible generosity that oftentimes people are too humble to allow us to speak about. But because I'm the pastor, I get this insight into seeing the amazing ways that people are living and giving sacrificially in order to help others. And so I do believe they are being the church. They are living this out. The problem is, for me, it's not the substantial one. The problem is that under the same banner, evangelical, and I have to use that banner because that's in the name of our denomination, the Evangelical Covenant Church. And again, that's been a banner. If you heard my opening thing, I'm really, really proud of what that is officially. I've always been proud to be an evangelical. It is, in fact, as the word means in Greek, it's good news to the world. So I really believe that. But the other kinds of things that are happening under that same name that we are now associating with includes bigotry and xenophobia and power politics and exploitation of the poor, lies, misogyny, all of these kinds of things. I think if you were to ask the typical young person on the street, hey, describe an evangelical, in the first 5 things they say would come up power hungry, anti-LGBTQ, racist, and hypocritical. One of our impulses always be, hey, how do we create relationships and friendships with as many people as possible? We're broad tent people. We want the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Catholics all to get along. That's our strength. The weakness of it is then we allow so many people to use that name and even misuse that name that white nationalists have been able to use it. And we're better at welcoming people than we are at setting boundaries and saying, hey, that actually is contrary to the gospel. We're sort of cutting you out. I think we've been so eager to have people join onto our bandwagon that we have maybe not been strict enough about what it means to be an evangelical, and I think therefore the name has gotten diluted.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting point. I would heartily concur with you that evangelicals are really, the first to go in and the last to leave areas of crisis. I was struck by a New York Times column written by Nicholas Kristof, who is not a Christian, who is, not a person of any sort of faith that would resemble evangelicalism, actually speaking to this point that he was critiquing his liberal elite friends who seemed to have determined that evangelicals were the one group that it was okay to ridicule. You can't ridicule any group, but at a cocktail party, perfectly legitimate and actually to your benefit to ridicule evangelicals. But he was making for the very strong case for the presence of evangelicals in exactly the way that you've defined. The reason why I make my comment is because I would agree that there is a center of Christ-following evangelicals that are fervent and faithful in that faith, to kind of witness. But you have already described a situation of dilution. And what I'm describing is not the situation of the faithful within that core. I'm describing the broader outworkings under the tent. And it's that broader outworking that needs a substantial discipleship of what does it really mean not to be sociologically affiliated, but theologically grounded, spiritually renewed, and socially equipped to engage. So I would say in any given evangelical church in various parts of the country, you will either have a more faithful core or more expansive comfort, kind of a comfortable faith. Dave, I would suggest to you that you live in a part of the country that in order to go to church, you've already self-selected. You've already self-selected because there's no social benefit to go to a church in Boston. So anyone asking about the Christian faith even is asking it at a pretty serious level. But there are other parts of the country where Christianity is still a fairly dominant and pervasive cultural context. And I'm not impugning different parts of the country and the vibrancy of their faith. But what I am suggesting is that in many other parts of the country, you have different strands of evangelicalism that permit a situation where the core, in your case, has maybe a periphery around it that is small, because the walls to enter into High Rock are pretty high. But the walls to enter into an evangelical church in other parts of the country are much lower. And so the faithful, kind of theologically grounded, spiritually renewed, socially engaged kind of evangelical exists in these churches, but there's a periphery that's much larger. And what I am hoping for, and I'm by no means deluded into thinking it's an easy ambition. What I'm hoping for is, rather than thinking about can we jettison the periphery and start anew and rename ourselves just with the core, but rather build upon the bridge, not simply to the secular culture as a whole, but to the Christian subculture that has lost a depth of discipleship and public theology, spiritual renewal, and a cohesion of engagement that it can inform the ways that they approach the political dynamics of our country. And so it's really a dissection of a similar set of problems from a different angle and from a different cultural context than what, having lived in New England myself with, 20 years, I get that. Now being in a very different cultural context, I'm seeing something different. And now at the NAE, working with 40 different denominations and 100 plus different Christian institutions across the country, there are dynamics that are in different parts of the country that are quite different. And so to answer your question, you have to answer, well, are you talking about evangelicalism in New England? Or are you talking about it in the Deep South? Are you talking about in the Mid-Atlantic? or the West, because you're really talking about different set of issues than any one place. So it's not evangelicalism, it's evangelicalisms that you're talking about.
I agree with everything you said. My question around this is, are we actually validating and in fact fueling, giving power to the white nationalists who gather under the banner of evangelicalism by continuing to use that same term? The reason the media pays so much attention to those voices is because evangelicals represent such a large portion of our country. And yet, I think the kind of evangelicals that I keep seeing on TV, now I see these people on TV, I hear their rhetoric, their kind of hateful rhetoric, their xenophobic rhetoric, and I just think, oh my gosh, these people are terrible, hold it. They're supposed to be representing me, right? And but I think that reason that media is paying attention to some of these leaders is because there's so many of us. Whereas if the kind of organizations that give us credibility, which we could not, in the time we have, we couldn't name all of them. There's so many good ones, Sojourners and International Justice Mission, and so many of these great groups. Then we allow those groups to give kind of validity and cultural approval to some of the white nationalists who are misusing that name.
I think this gets to one of the inherent weaknesses of even a robust evangelicalism, that we as evangelicals in America, now the situation in England is different as well as Europe, but just speaking for the American context, we are profoundly good at the individualistic elements, the pietistic elements of evangelical faith, the notion of personal conversion. We're also really, really good at the good deeds part of it. So the Great Revival, Second Great Awakening is a wonderful example of that. The amount of good work that happened in society, the elimination of child labor laws, the abolitionist movement, the desire to give greater empowerment to women, even societies arising for the protection of animals. I mean, all the stuff that you might deem, oh, this is the progressive agenda now, that actually all came out of vibrant evangelical faith. You're as equally prone to go to the altar and get converted and as you were to then go out and as a part of that conversion, live it out in a transformational way in society. What hasn't happened is a cohesive public theology that pulls the individual conversion and the acts of good deeds into a whole understanding of the nature of society and the role of the church in society. So it is still possible to have a church actively engaged in personal conversion, actively engaged in doing good work in a soup kitchen or good work in any number of visitations to orphanages and so forth, and still not have a sense of what's the church's relationship in the politics of society, what's the church's relationship in the nature of our presence in culture. Is our posture one of lobbing out good works with the hope that that will get understood and brought in? Or is there real possibility for the transformation of society and the notion of grace that would still permit our ability to work together, even with people of different faith or no faith? And it's that lack of a public theology that prevents a lot of evangelicals of very goodwill. The kind of evangelicals you're talking about are just totally perplexed with what's going on, from understanding, well, what do we do about that? How do we engage in a way that we're represented in the halls of power without compromising ourselves in pursuing power, of being a leavening influence? It's because we have this pietistic notion, either that power should be avoided because it's corrupting, or we have a narrow notion of good deeds that transform individuals out there, maybe even our local city. But what we lack is what Catholics often have, and not necessarily living up to, but have this notion of Catholic social thinking, social thought that is more comprehensive in nature. I think British evangelicalism has something more robust of that, which is why they never went through this modernist fundamentalist divide. The very fact that Americans evangelicalism went through that modernist fundamentalist divide means that we do not have a comprehensive theology that understands how do we relate to the discoveries of science? How do we relate to secular sources of knowledge? How do we relate in common grace and common good? That, I think, is a huge problem that limits evangelicals of goodwill and representative, like we would wish for that to be representative, to even know how to do that because we don't have that public square. And that's a big problem. That's something that the NAE, that I wouldn't take up this position if I wasn't firmly convinced that there's a possibility and a need that exists all the more now than ever before, perhaps, for an evangelical public theology. And I feel that the NAE is positioned to provide that, given the network of people that exist in it, given the kinds of work that is being pursued, and the possibility for producing that in the NAE. Will it work? Time will tell.
So here's my concern about that strategy. I think you're absolutely right. What we need is some kind of canon, some way of saying this is kind of what evangelical faith is. And I get it. You guys are trying to do that. I think that statement, I think everything you guys wrote in the statement is really good, and I was proud to sign it. So I'm totally with that. I'm jaded enough to believe that the vast majority of Americans who think evangelical just means Christian person, good citizen, patriot, they basically have conflated evangelical and white nationalism. They're never going to read your statement, and they won't care. And so, but they're going to continue calling themselves evangelicals no matter what kind of good work you do to try to give it some definition. They'll never hear that and not care. Yeah. So looking back at our own history, my understanding is, when Finney would do these great revivals back in the 18th century, if you became forward to accept Christ, the very next thing you did was come and you either signed up to get in the women's suffrage movement or the abolitionist movement, right? You were either going to fight for the vote of women or for the enfranchisement of Black Americans. And that was just seen. That's the very first thing after you became a Christian, is you signed up for one or the other. Yeah. And so that's our history. Then we, as you talked about, we came into the fundamentalist modernist separation, where the two sides of the church that wanted to be really devoted to the authority of God and the preaching of the gospel, got separated from the people who wanted to follow Jesus by loving the poor and helping the hurting and caring for creation. And these groups got separated. But in the 1950s, you got the folks like Harold John Ockenga and Pew, of the what is now today the Pew Charitable Trust, Billy Graham, Carl Henry. These guys got together and said, hey, instead of trying to either fix the fundamentalists or the modernists and try to redefine one of those, they said, in order to put forth a positive theology, be able to say what we really want to say, which is, comes down essentially to those things that we talked about, those 4 principles of Bevington that I mentioned before we started our conversation. In order to do that, then they said, hey, we're going to pick a new name, and it's an old new name. And so they called themselves the Neo-Evangelicals. We're saying, hey, we're hearkening back to this new thing. And those people who already identified as fundamentalists or modernists, great, you understood yourself as something different. If you were an evangelical, you were this. Well, that worked for a good 30 years until after the kind of loss of reputation of the moral majority, and especially after 9/11, all the fundamentalists started calling themselves evangelicals. And then the white nationalists started calling themselves evangelicals. And there wasn't any group that had the authority to say, oh, no, that's out of bounds. That's not who we are. That's not what we believe. That's not what we do. And so I wonder, are we able to have some kind of authority structure, some kind of way of having definition without starting from scratch with a new name and giving it definition?
Yeah, and again, time will tell. I mean, the name issue is, profoundly slippery. right? You can at what point do you need to reclaim a name? At what point is a new name going to come up that makes sense? And again, I am less concerned about that, because even if we came up with a new name, if we don't have this public theology piece, that new name will have the same problem 20 years from now, 30 years from now. I'm going to give you an example. Akingay, that generation, I am so appreciative of their legacy. But I'm going to pick the issue of race because it's apropos to the moment. Akingay was preaching against racism in the 1930s, at the very beginning of his ministry. And he was very clear that evangelical faith needed to, one of his sermons talked about evangelical faith needing to address the sin of labor, the sin of war, the sin of race. I mean, it's extraordinary what he was talking about. And the NAE made official statements against racism in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But the NAE didn't show up in the civil rights movement. And the NAEs, and I'm just going to be brutally honest about this because this is the organization in its own history. I do not want to impugn anyone else. And I think part of the evangelical response needs to be holding up the mirror to ourselves. And so I will hold it up to the NAE. The NAE, I think there are many that chose not to because they still did not figure out. We can condemn racism. We can build individual relationships across the black-white divide. We can start good works in various neighborhoods, but we do not want to get involved in a political movement called the civil rights movement. And we were also very concerned at the NAE for the rise of communism. And so there was this deep suspicion that the civil rights movement was being associated with communism because of how the civil rights movement and the movement against poverty was being conjoined in, for instance, Martin Luther's speeches. So to me, that indicates that there was still something that was not yet worked out in evangelicalism, even of the Akingay sort, that understood the nature of engagement. And the instinct was still, if there's a problem, let's just found a Christian organization. It wasn't, let's go engage, as messy as it is, in what's happening in society. And rather than thinking about infiltrating into these other parts of society as a leavening influence, it's let's just start a new Christian ministry to solve this problem. So the response, even of evangelicals, was still one that did not work out. What does it mean to be a presence in society? It was still the default position. Well, can we come up with yet another Christian ministry that was still going to be insular in its focus because it did have a litmus test of theology. You know, are you a Christian? Now, the Christian ministries that have arisen, they're doing amazing work. And so I'm not saying, I mean, they're part of the NAE, many of them, international justice, which you name it, compassion, world vision. So that work needs to happen. But in addition, I'm still advocating for the fact that you can change your name, but you're not going to solve the problem until we understand the nature of faith in society. Because we're just going to repeat what the NAE did and what Christians are doing right now, 10, 20, 30 years from now. So it's more than a name. It's kind of why I keep on harping on it. It's more substantial than a name change, a rebranding. Though I am happy to entertain that rebranding if it actually prevents us from doing this more substantial work, which is a distinct possibility. The term may be so toxic that we could never do that work that I'm trying to advocate for. And if the Lord guides in that direction, as a good evangelical, I would wish to listen to the Spirit of the Lord to advance the cause of the gospel. And we'll drop the name. But I'm not quite ready to do that because it's rooted in such a deeply theological, essential concept of being people of the Evangelion, people of the good news. And evangelicalism has fallen in hard times. Christianity has fallen in hard times. The name of Christianity has been held in great disrepute because the way it didn't show up during the Holocaust, for instance. And yet, Christians didn't jettison the name Christian just because they failed to show up in certain times. And so, for those historical reasons, I still think it may be possible to recover the name evangelical and to reinfuse it by God's grace with meaning that gives honor to Christ.
Well, I'd love to talk to you about this for a lot longer. I know that you have to run off to another meeting. You're very popular these days. And so we're going to sign off here with you. But if you're watching this, I want to tell you just to stay on because even though Walter Kim has got to move on to another call, we're going to have Pastors Megan and DeAndre come in and join me. And we're going to do a live chat, answer people's questions. We just want to hear from you. So please stay on with us. Walter, again, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to the next time we get to talk. Many blessings to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Whoops.
There you go.
There we go. We're glad to have you back, and we hope you found that conversation interesting. We'd love to kind of hear from you, get some of your questions and responses, and we can sort of interact with that a little bit. I'm just going to, feel free to write these in the comments, and I'm just going to kind of take a few things off of that, what I see, and just try to interact with them, and then can keep the conversation going. Somebody asks, how has the term evangelical been shaped or skewed by the media, and how should that inform how we engage with the question of whether or not to keep it? So I think what has happened is the media is using the term evangelical to describe, as I think I mentioned this earlier, the kind of multiple groups that are fundamentalists and the white nationalists that would not fit into the definition of evangelical. And in fact, when I was, I worked in church in Virginia for a time, an evangelical church, and I was invited to be the speaker at this week-long camp. And I was intrigued because it was a camp that was owned by fundamentalists, but they were renting it out. And so the group that had brought me in was renting it out. And there was actually a sign in my room when I got there, like a, kind of sign that would say, hey, here's what you do with your linens. They made it clear that evangelicals were not allowed in this camp because they understood us as very different from them. And the way that we were different is we were really into social justice. So yes, we shared their strong convictions around biblical authority. We shared their strong convictions around a life-changing encounter with God and the centrality of the cross. We shared that, but we were distinct in that where the fundamentalists tended to circle the wagons and say, hey, let's stay safe in here and keep the bad people out. The evangelicals had exactly the opposite idea. Say, hey, we want our kids to go to Harvard and Yale. We want to end up having conversations. We want to mix it up with everybody. We think we have great ideas. We want to get into that marketplace of ideas and really encounter people. We want to bring social reform and actually, do good for people. Those are key components of what distinguished evangelicals and fundamentalists in the past. Well, now those groups have been brought together. And my own sense is, in our current age, when people are feeling so polarized, what's happening is you got a bunch of people kind of in the middle being pushed to the extremes, just like we saw during the fundamentalist modernist debate back during the Scopes trials. We're seeing this again in our popular media, and people are getting into the echo chambers, just like happened in the previous, depending on which newspapers you were reading back then, you were getting really different stories and different perceptions. So people are being pushed into kind of our corners, and as we do that, people are just becoming more extreme, and so more people are moving back towards that fundamentalist, separatist, hey, we've got to go back and take back our country kind of idea. But nowadays, because it's no longer kosher to use the word fundamentalist, right? 9/11 kind of ruined that. Nobody wanted to be known as fundamentalists anymore. So now they call themselves evangelicals. And the media doesn't know the difference. You say you're an evangelical, fine, you're an evangelical. I don't know, I trust you. And that is what has created a lot of this confusion. And so I would say it's not the media's fault, per se. I don't think they created this. I don't think we should expect them to be theologians. I'm not looking for them to do this. And so if somebody self-reports to be an evangelical, they just take their word for it. Because there is nobody who owns the term, sort of copyrighted it and say, hey, this is what it is, and you can't use it. As a result, unlike with, if you use the label Southern Baptist or the label Anglican, there is some group who has the authority to say what that means. There is not a group that has the authority to say what evangelical means. And I think that's what allows for this real confusion. And so in terms of whether we should keep it or not, I'm saying I don't think so. Now, I do want to be associated with all these great saints going in the past. I think there have been so many beautiful things done in the name of evangelicalism. And I want to keep the spirit of all of those things. But maybe I think part of keeping the spirit of it is maybe changing the name, because I don't want to be even giving sort of tacit permission for white supremacy and some of these other things that are happening under the evangelical banner. I would also point out, this is kind of just maybe an aside, but it has been true, if you were to just actually take the strict definition of evangelicals, many, many, many churches in the Black tradition in America actually are evangelical. They don't use that word particularly. Some do, some don't. But many of them have an evangelical faith. And that's why I think now the word evangelical is no longer tied to the people who are actually living out what evangelicalism is designed to be. And that's why I think maybe jettisoning the name and finding a new banner to gather under might make more sense.
Do you think,
Megan, what do you guys think?
I just was wondering, John had put this comment about how one of the major media conglomerates previously had used Billy Graham as a mouthpiece. So this juxtaposition, or the media versus evangelicals, but I've also heard Kristen Numez is a scholar who's recently written a book on tracing masculinity within evangelicalism called Jesus and John Wayne. And she sort of traces the use, the way that evangelicals have, like you said, positioned themselves in places to be part of the cultural dialogue, that it's actually never been part of our tradition to be separate from the world. And so we would have used media previously to get across ideas. The revivals were all really published in newspapers and advertised, and the whole rise of the Christian music industry and Christian bookstores. And so there are ways that I think that evangelicals have chosen to use media. So to say, should we just take it back from the media because we don't like what they're saying about us? Well, no, isn't that part of any relationship? If you're not going to be separate from the world, if we are going to not love the world, right, but to be a part of the world as the hands and feet of Christ, we don't get to pick and choose when they represent us, and probably call out some of the places where we have leaned too far into using mediums of the world for what we perceive to be our own gains. Do you see a way forward, I guess, or a more healthy balance, a healthy relationship with the world, so that it's not a question of relevancy? We're people, we live in the world, we have neighbors and problems and questions, but sort of that striking a power balance there. I guess that's a question that I have out of that.
Well, for me, it's actually not a fight with the media. I don't think the media is at fault. I don't think they created this. And I would point out that the statistic I hear quoted all the time, everywhere I go, every time I read an article about why it is that young people are leaving the evangelical church, it always comes back to the statistic that 81% of people in the 2016 election voted for 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. And since for some people that means that they were willing to compromise some of their values so much in order to get this person in that would give them some power, but were also willing to then tolerate not only somebody who, adulterous and multiple marriages, all that other kind of stuff, but it's they understood, a lot of people understood that as somebody who was approving or allowing space for white supremacy. And so they're willing to tolerate racism. Now, I don't think, I'm sure that these 81% of people, they're not all racist. That's for certain. There are some people who think a lot of them are, but I think that's actually not the point. The point is they were willing to tolerate people who were pursuing racist policies, even if unaware of the fact that those policies were racist. And so I think that really burned a lot of bridges. But you know who came up with that statistic, 81%? It was Pew. The Pew Foundation are the ones who did the research. They funded the research. And can I remind you, that is a Christian organization. Now, it serves the public good, but they all started out by Christians, and that was their kind of original mission, is to bring truth to society. So I don't think that the people who are doing this are malicious against us. I think they're going and asking people how they identify, and the people are reporting, oh, I'm an evangelical. Now, it was very interesting in that same election. If you asked people, this same population, have you prayed recently? Have you read your Bible in the last week? Have you attended church in the last month? If you took the people who did the things that evangelicals tend to do, that number of people who had voted for Trump was actually, of the white evangelicals, was much smaller. And so that's where I think that name has been diluted. But I don't blame the media for this. To me, that's a false narrative.
I wonder too I think what happens often is we're assuming that some of the individuals that are in these positions that are part of the media, or that are in these positions even in the government, do not identify themselves as evangelical. And so when we talk about evangelicalisms, I guess I have tension with getting to decide you're a part of the family, and now because you act out a certain way, you're no longer a part of the family, and that's because you're not living up to what it means to be an evangelical, when perhaps what we're seeing is a manifestation of what it means to be evangelical. And so when I hear people say we're not a part of that evangelical movement or whatever it may be, that group of evangelicals, but I'm looking at those who are dragging people that look like me out of the car, or putting someone like the current president that we have in a position and endorsing that type of behavior, they bear that name evangelicalism. So either you're not living out of what it means to be evangelical, or we need to disassociate ourselves with a term that is beginning to manifest itself and accept that this is the DNA of what it means to be an evangelical. And I think for some people that have grown up in that so long, it's hard. It's like teaching someone who's been taught to be a bigot that what they're doing is not of God, and expecting to be able to just to strip that overnight and it not to be painful, like, is an unrealistic expectation. And I think most people cringe against letting go of that term because it hurts and it's all that they know. It's like I used to tell some members in a church that I was serving, have you identified more with the church than you identify with God? And so now your identity is not in Christ. Your identity is being a Methodist, or your identity is not being a Christian or being a believer, but your identity is being evangelical. And so when we strip that term away, instead of assessing what it really means for us to be a follower of Christ, we'd much rather hold on to a term like evangelical. And even when you talk about in the Black space, again, living out of what it truly means to be evangelical, but even in that space, detesting the use of that word evangelical. We do not identify as evangelicals, even though we might practice those fundamentals of what it means to be an evangelical. I know I can go back to the little holiness church that I grew up in, and they would never identify as an evangelical. And politically, you're going to see a difference when we look at that 81% of those that voted for Trump. And then I guess I would go back to, there's a professor at Duke who teaches about the Black apocalypse, and just the response to just the president that we had with President Obama, and this fear in white evangelicals of having lost power. And so the response to a president like Obama being elected, you start seeing this played out in the movies like Hunger Games and Handmaids and all these other different things, where the African American used in those books are what whiteness fears, so this loss of power, and the African American character used as a sacrifice to redeem what evangelicalism has said. This is what it looks like. And so those who have overcome, and just the danger in those type of things for someone like me to look at evangelicalism, even though I may believe in inerrancy of scripture, I believe in whether maybe it's heterosexual marriage or whatever it may be that individual may believe in, they're not going to identify as a term like evangelical because of the pain that it has caused our community. And if they are identifying to it, the luxury of being able to migrate into a space of whiteness where I don't have to deal with the everyday sufferings of people that look like me. And yeah, on occasion, I might be reminded that I'm Black, but for the other 95, 96% of the time, being whatever political party that associates with the evangelical serves me well. And so I'll camp under that term. And so we have to make a distinction in that's the difficulty of evangelicalism, is that we can't hoard onto the term and saying that you don't get to decide who you kick in and out of the house. And so we have to make that choice to say, you know what, perhaps the values of this movement are really starting to show its face. And as a body, as a believer of Christ, this is not something that I want to be associated with. And so are we willing to preserve our profession of our faith, I think, at the stake of using a name? And I ask people who are so adamant about using the N-word or terms that are bigoted, what is it so powerful about that term that you want to hold on to it? And is it more precious than our objective as a follower of Christ, of reclaiming the humanity of our brothers and our sisters?
Well, I think this brings up, so Jean actually asked a good question, which is a great follow-up to what you just said, Pastor DeAndre. Jean Sorrell said, how does one get into the new name club? What are the qualifications, and how does one define it to exclude those groups of people we don't want to be associated with? I think that is a great question. I mean, that's the work we would have to do. If we were to make a decision and we're no longer willing to be called evangelicals, we need to do the positive work then of defining what is this new thing. But then we, again, by coining a term, can give it definition, much like denominations have always done. So while we can't decide who is evangelical or not, there is a body that can decide if you are an evangelical covenant church or not. And if you don't kind of believe certain ways, behave certain ways, whatever, they can then say, hey, you're outside the boundaries and you can no longer use that name because that's our name and we've defined it in a particular way. So I think that we could come up with a name and then be able to say, here's the values that we're gathering around, and we're setting kind of this as the center, and these are the limits. And kind of these are the sort of the price of admission is endorsing this platform or something like that. And that would allow people then self-select in a way that is very clear. Right now, it's not clear what I'm saying yes to if I call myself an evangelical. You have to, people like me know it because, I study this. But the average person in a pew of some evangelical church, they have no clue what makes an evangelical. And so as a result, it's not clear what they're affirming. And I'd like to have it be more explicit what they're affirming if they were to join this movement. And obviously, all we're going to get are sinners, right? And that's going to be all of us too. So we're going to get terrible people and people who have, implicit bias. We're going to get people who, are thoughtless with their words and insensitive. We're going to get all of them because they're us. It's a different thing for me to say, because none of us are going to be perfect. But what I can say is I recognize, when I do fall into those things, I can recognize them. Hey, that's wrong. I repent of that. I'm not endorsing this behavior. I'm not saying it's acceptable. I'm recognizing it. I think it's odious when someone else does it, and I think it's odious when I do it. And I think there are a lot of people in evangelicalism today who would not acknowledge as odious. Like they may say, hey, gosh, I grew up as a racist, and it's hard to get that out of my head, and, I get that. Okay, fair enough. But can you agree that it is something you'd want to get out of your head, that it's an evil thing that you want to be healed from? And there are a lot of people in evangelicalism today who would not agree to that. And I think that's the part where that's just one example. I actually think we've been talking a lot about race, but materialism, the over-identification with political parties, I think all of these things would be things that if I were designing it, which nobody's asking me to do, but if I were to do that, well, then I would design and say, hey, we're not, by design, we are never going to sign on to the platform of any political party, because every political party is a compromise, and we do not believe in this. We have a citizenship in heaven, and we'll use political parties, but we won't be used by them. I think there's just a lot of things like that I want to be able to name. So it's more than just things about race.
I feel like it gets tricky, like any human institution. It's one of the reasons that I love the Covenant Church is that there aren't doctrines that you are supposed to like subscribe to in order to be part of it, but they try to hold things in these affirmations to say like these are our centers. And so as long as you're like walking towards Christ as the center, and you can, hold the authority of Scripture, and there's like such a broad range of even that, and yet like our human instinct when we are in relationships with folks who are different from us, it's so hard to hold centers. We'd rather create boundaries because it helps us to like let us protect ourselves from who's in and who's out. I know I can let my guard down more comfortably and be held accountable by a Christian who isn't going to push me on this one, fundamental thing, like should women preach or not? Well, I probably couldn't feel like truly held accountable or safe enough to be held accountable in my sin with a person who was like, absolutely not, women can't preach, because that's like a pretty core part of like who God's made me to be. And yet, when we create those boundaries that feel safe to us, I wonder who we leave out. So what Walter said in there about, for High Rock in particular, that we might have a core that can sort of live in the tension of these centered set, that's that framework, that centered set relationship. What do we do with the other people all over the rest of the world who prefer a bounded set in other ways? Because I prefer bounded set spaces in my life in other places too. I'm like, does the boundary that we would set for this new name club, does that shift? Is it allowed to shift as time continues on? Which I just think is another thing that all institutions run into as they progress. And so I just hold that, yes, like no one is asking you to design this, Dave, but even by opening this conversation, like we're naming that it is a live thing that we're exploring. And so it's not as easy as just saying, let's start a new name club. Because here's all the things we're against. We don't want to be associated with that, and this is what we're for, and that will shift. So I just hold that as a tension point for me in this.
I do wonder. One of the things we have talked actively about, and I mentioned this in the very beginning before we talked to Walter, is we are contemplating trying to lead a movement within our denomination to change the name, and I think. As we talk about, okay, how do we, some people have been asking, how do we interact with the media around this and sort of make this distinction? I think if a denomination as large as ours were to make a statement because of its associations with white nationalism and hate and xenophobia and misogyny, because of all of these things, we could list more, because of these things, we are no longer willing to use this name and we are changing our name. I think that would be a powerful statement about how repugnant we find those things. I wonder if I think that might be worth saying.
Mm.
I think it also starts the way, I know Walter said that it was deeper than the changing of a name, and just that it had to be something that happened in-house. But I think sometimes we just need to be confronted with that change of the name. So even as we start to practice things, we can remember, we're not evangelical, and we're not evangelical. So it's more than we're not a part of those evangelicals. And so when we think about whatever it means to be a part of the body of believers that we are, it is that we are not misogynistic. It is that we're not dehumanizing of people, but that we are welcoming people into a relationship with Creator. And so the power in making that statement that we are disassociating ourselves with this name because it is associated with things such as what you've named, I think it is so needed I've often said one of the biggest, I think, setbacks for our country as a whole is that America has not denounced racism. It has not denounced misogynistic behaviors. It has not denounced our issues with the LGBTQ community. And so we just continue to kind of either ignore it or say that's not who we are anymore without ever really affirming or acknowledging that we have been that before. And so to keep saying, well, we're not those evangelicals, instead of owning that at the end of the day, if you take on that name, you take on all the weight that comes with that name. And so just like we take on the good, we have to be also willing to accept that the bad comes with it. And most of the time, in our case, the bad is outweighed that good. I shared, even with you all earlier, just how as I make that known to my friends that I'm a part of an evangelical movement, this instant kind of response are defining of the evangelical church that I'm a part of and justifying my choice or this call that I feel to be a part of this evangelical church that is not living out of what we've seen culturally regarding the evangelical church.
In the chat, Grace writes that other synonyms for evangelical are fundamentalist, Bible-believing, creationists, or maybe practicing. I think it's very interesting. So I actually, theoretically, kind of at a technical level, fundamentalist would never have been thought of as a synonym to evangelical just 20 years ago, right? This would have been unthinkable. Well, I guess it was about 20 years ago, right? It was 9/11, right about 20 years ago that this change was made. And so before that, those would have been seen as actually deliberate counterpoints to each other. And I think creationists, that's a part of the fundamentalist piece that the evangelicals, even back in the 1940s and 50s, were actually resisting. And so it's funny now but I think that actually perfectly makes my point. I think Grace is really just bringing this right to the fore, because now, where those things used to be seen as in opposition, now they're seen as actually synonyms of the same thing. That's where I feel like this word has become so diluted, it's not useful for us anymore.
There was a chat question earlier. James asked how many elements then, I felt like this is how many elements of our faith should we modify then to increase the positive perception? So, DeAndre, you just named the things that we would be against. Like, would there be a way to help define, in your estimation, like what we are for? What does that look like?
The question you've just posed to DeAndre is a little different than the way I read the one from James.
Sure.
And James, you can clarify for us if you want. How many elements of our faith should we modify to increase positive perception of our faith? I don't think we should modify any of the elements of our faith in order to increase the positive perception. That I believe our faith on its own, what it actually is, the substance of it, is already a beautiful and positive thing. So I don't think we need to change our faith. We actually need to allow it to be seen for what it is. And right now, I think the word evangelical obscures that. It makes it harder to see who we really are, what we really believe, and what we're really offering the world, which is, I believe, really good news, which is ironically what evangelical means. I don't think we need to change our faith. We should not change it just to win public perception. We shouldn't change the core of it. I think we can change the name of it, but if we change the core of it in order to win approval, that's exactly what Jesus warned against, right? At that point, we become actors. We're kind of just playing a role and trying to become popular. So I don't know that. I think that that's not what we're trying to do. We're actually trying to say, no, we don't want to change our faith. We want to have it defined as what it is.
And I think just to kind of piggyback on that more of first understanding that we give attention to these things not because we want public popularity, but at the core of this, it has to be the humanity of individuals. And so even just entertaining the conversation, I'll tell you, for me, I have a difficult time looking at the cross as a Black man in this country, that there's historical fear that has been instilled in my community with burning crosses in our yards. And the fact that I think raises trauma in people that make up your community, it's worth having the discussion. And it can never be about public popularity. It has to be about affirming the humanity in those that we are in relationship with on a daily basis, and those that we say we want to feel safe in a worshiping space. And does that mean we throw the cross out? It doesn't, but it does mean that we need to affirm the history in this country that's been embedded on that cross. And so we can't continue to do a polished cross that ignores the pain and the trauma that exists in this country. And I think that's what we're dealing with this term of evangelicalism. It's getting rid of more than just the term, but understanding that term has been associated with so much harm that has taken place in just throughout the country, and it being used and associated with Christ. And so when we look at those things, it has to be because we want to affirm the humanity in people.
That's right. Kat asks a conversation. She says, I came in late. Have we already talked about how the global church sees evangelicalism beyond U.S. politics? And we have not talked much about that. We really have been talking about it in the United States. I would say this, that I spend a lot of time in sort of this kind of Central East Africa. And there, evangelicalism is in many ways tied to the health and wealth, prosperity kind of preachers who, again, would not necessarily actually fall under the strict definition of evangelical, but those are the people waving the evangelical flag in East and Central Africa. And so, but I think that's just a different form of dilution than what we're talking about here. I think in other places, in a lot of places, evangelicalism has a wonderful reputation because people have experienced the way that evangelicals have built alliances and built bridges. Again, that's what we're good at, and we're good at serving people who are hurting. And those two things have won a lot of trust in a lot of places. Unfortunately, over time, what ends up happening is evangelicals come in as a sort of a marginal group. They serve, they gain a good reputation locally, and then now a lot of other people start using the banner to be able to do their own thing, but get the respectability that was earned by the people who were out there suffering and sweating and serving. And I think that cycle keeps happening around the globe, and we've seen it happen here in the United States.
And her question, I think, is like about the perception of evangelicalism. I guess, Kat, like, is that a clarifier? Is there a question of how they see it, like how they see us within the United States as evangelicals? Like, I know the Evangelical Covenant Church of Sweden disavowed that name a long time ago, and now they're a part of like a network with other churches. It's non-denominational, so they can still hold a lot of the core central tenets, but it's under a different banner that has removed evangelical from the title because of the public perception of evangelicalism as it's associated primarily with the fundamentalist roots within the United States and how that transferred to Sweden. And so, like, it has been a back and forth, but Walter mentioned a more positive view of evangelicalism within Great Britain as far as it's located there, not necessarily of American evangelicalism. So I think that they're sort of separate beasts, but given the United States position in the world, like, it's sort of become synonymous now. So I think those were all the questions that I saw in the chat. And it is about that time. Like, this has gone really well. I do want to ask one final question. DeAndre, you were brought here to help shepherd our high school students, their families, to help imagine how to equip them to be like full members of our body, because we believe that they are. What does this mean for them? A decision like this, of us are in high school, and like, what does it mean for the next generation to consider the phrase evangelical and bearing that title?
I think most probably find it a lot more difficult than we do, and probably don't use it as often as we do. There are probably some who won't invite them to church because the term is in there. But I do think one of the blessings and the pleasures that we have being at High Rock is that for the most part, our students can see the difference from what they see in the media and from theology that they hear coming from this space. And I think that's always the most important is that they hear it from leadership. And so what does that look like in this context, and entertaining those questions and those social issues that our students are concerned with, and it being a safe space to say, I'm not too comfortable with using that term evangelical, and being equipped to walk with them and to give them that freedom to have that conversation and to work on it. And so I don't know if I see evangelicalism in the future, at least not under that term. And I don't know if I think that's a bad thing, but I'm hopeful.
I corroborate exactly what you're saying, Pastor DeAndre, because we've had a number of students who graduate, come through our program, are part of High Rock for many, many years. By the way, an evangelical covenant church, go off to college, learn about evangelicals, and come back and then sort of, are talking about it, and then discover somehow, sideways, hold it, what? What, we're evangelicals? No. I learned about them in college. They're really different. And so I think that has been, they have seen a very generous and, warm and embracing, kind of evangelicalism that loves God and loves neighbor. And I think they've grown up with this sense of the goodness of that, but then see something different as they go on in other circles. And that word ends up becoming a real thing for us to leap over. And that's part of for me, that is part of why this conversation is so important.
And I guess for those of you that are watching and might not be familiar with High Rock, this is not all self-congratulatory. Like, we are a group, like Dave said, of imperfect people who don't get it right all the time. But the reason that we wanted to have this conversation in a public and flawed forum was because we actually think that that's one of the best things we can offer in this brand of whatever we're going to call it, is the ability to have hard conversations, that we know we don't have all of the answers and that we need one another to dialogue and to seek to follow Jesus more faithfully. And so hopefully this is going to be a regular feature here of High Rock Online, where Pastor Dave will sit with many different people and talk about things that we don't find approachable in other areas of life. And so if there is something that you would like to see Pastor Dave have a conversation about, put that in the chat. You can send us a message on High Rock Online. And we'd love to see you next month or so when we host another one of these. Keep your questions coming. Feel free to share this with your friends or neighbors who just don't totally understand the questions that you're wrestling with. Because I think as a Christian, these kinds of conversations can consume a lot of my energy and myself, and my non-Christian friends are like, why? I don't understand. It's like, well, but this is an existential crisis that I'm undergoing, and it might help translate that for you in those relationships. And so, Dave, DeAndre, thank you so much for your time. Walter, if you watch this, thank you. We have just been blessed by this time together. And for High Rock Online, for those of you that showed up tonight, thanks for being with us in this journey. We looked forward to continuing it together.
Good. Thanks, you all. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Bye.
Good night.